standing up for. So it is with that in mind that I welcome you to our first Eye on Zion webinar with Hussein Aboubakr, a very dear friend, a colleague, and another leader in his own right. Hussein was born and raised in Egypt to hate the Jews. And through his own education and through his own journey, he became one of the most outspoken defenders of Israel and the Jewish people. I'm very happy, very pleased to welcome and allow Hussein to address our topic of the night, which is how Hamas fits into the larger war against the Jews, a war that is aided and abetted by the West. Hussein.
Thank you very much, Masha, for your kind words. It's great to be here with Club Z. I've known Masha for many years, and I've been privileged to have been part of Club Z journey and speaking to Club Z students and see them actually grow and embark on their different journeys in life. A lot of them, my friends on social media, it always warms my heart to see this once, young students now doing all those great things in life. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me, Masha. And thank you, all the audience who tuned in tonight for this webinar. And I have no doubt that this series of Eye on Zion is going to be a very a remarkable educational experience. From my experience with Club Z, I know that all of their speakers, I'm probably the most least informed person on a long list of remarkable people. So I'm very glad to be here. The title that we picked for today's webinar is Hamas between jihad and decolonization, and that's probably something that a lot of people are aware of, the fact that you do have this weird bifurcation of narratives that gives legitimacy for the terrorist and murderous actions of terrorist organizations like Hamas, between obviously something that's seems to be religious in terms of its appeal to religious or Islamic symbolism and Islamic concepts. At the same time, there's something that seems to be very secular. There's Hamas as a decolonization, self-determination, resistance movement. And you see how a lot of people on college campuses and in the Western media, defenders of terrorism, people who are anti-Israel or people who are a self-proclaimed critics of Israel. They're not anti-Semitic. They just hate colonialism and occupation and things of like that. Those great, beautiful people with beautiful souls, bleeding hearts for justice and truth, seem to be under the impression that Hamas, a movement that on October 7th invaded southern Israel, small towns of Israeli families, murdered people in cold blood in their own bedrooms and in their own living rooms, raped women. So the stories are still coming out. I mean, it keeps getting worse by the day every time you hear those things. Abducted and kidnapped children, babies, actual babies, not to mention horrific stories about babies found burned to death in the oven. So apparently this movement, we find people, very educated and very beautiful people in Harvard, at Columbia, at Princeton, who think that this is a resistance movement. This is legitimate. Their actions are liberating. Their actions, in the words of one Harvard professor, are exhilarating. And a lot of people look at this weird bifurcation of narratives, and something doesn't add up. Well, there is a lie somehow. Either Hamas is an Islamic terrorist organization and they are using all of those idiots on college campuses primarily in the West, or they are some sort of a revolutionary leftist movement and they are using those poor Muslims as conduits for their war. Well, what is it? I wish it was this simple, as everything real in life. The answers are usually complex, and multiple things could actually be true at the same time. When I first actually started looking at seeing the videos that were coming out on October 7th. I have a newborn. I have a 6 months old baby. So I was actually up in the middle of the night feeding the baby. It was like 2 a.m. And, as I'm feeding the baby, that was on the early morning of October 7th. And I'm like looking through my phone, and all of a sudden, on Twitter, you start seeing the videos coming out. And at the beginning, I think, this must be some, 2-4 terrorists max. Nobody imagined that this is how it is. But then, of course, I stay up. I didn't go back to bed and keep going, seeing the videos, and the videos keep getting worse. And then maybe 10 hours later, I think we had an idea about the scale of the tragedy. The videos that were released by Hamas, for the attacks, of course, glorifying and celebrating the murders, had an emblem in Arabic that was kind of imprinted when somebody does what do you call it? Kind of a stamp on the video, They had a little line that says, "This is the revolution of those who resist." And that was kind of the imprinting that the videos were issued by Hamas's media, office that works with the armed wing, and they had that imprinted in Arabic, not in English. The video was not intended for Harvard. That video was obviously intended for local consumption and among Arab speakers, and you already see that words like revolution, this is a revolution, this is a revolutionary resistance, are deployed right from the get-go. Later, a day after, when Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, was sitting in Qatar, he recorded a long video from his nice, fancy, opulent office in Doha, not too far from Al Udeid U.S. Air Force Base that actually has been protecting the Qatari monarchy for 2 decades now. He made this video in which he celebrated this great revolutionary act by Hamas. And he said that Hamas, or October 7th, I'm almost quoting here, that October 7th was not just an act of Hamas. And October 7th was a lever for the revolution of every Muslim, of every Arab. History is now being written by those who carry a rifle, who carry the rifles and bleed their blood, or something of that sort. This is the revolutionary rhetoric that Hamas employed towards its base of Arab supporters and Arabic speakers. And it's mixed. If you actually notice and how they are talking, it's obviously a mix. It's a deep mix that's inseparable between Islamic symbolism, Islam, and jihad. Jihad is a historical Islamic war institution. It's the Islamic tradition of warfare, right? Between jihad and revolutionary ideology, a deep anti-Semitic rhetoric about cleansing the earth from the Jews, and of course a lot of actual leftist ideology. So ideas of resistance and decolonization are also found in how they speak in Arabic. It's not just something that they use with the English speakers. But when you look at the Western celebrations, or not celebration, discussions of all of this, you'll find something that is akin to Django Unchained. Anybody watched that Quentin Tarantino movie? Kind of, those who didn't watch it, just this, America under slavery. It's an action thriller movie, and this former slave basically takes guns and keeps killing all the slave owners in the movie. It's very gory, kind of, a Hollywood bonanza of blood and the stuff that people like. And I think a lot of people, that's exactly how they saw Hamas. They saw Hamas. That's the narrative that they were told. It's a decolonization group of those oppressed people that is now embarking on this revolutionary liberationist action. And thus, this is justified, because by the very logic of social justice morality, any action against the oppressor is justified, is already legitimate. And here you have two discourses, as I said, two languages, let's say, that are both legitimating this extreme and brutal and ruthless violence against the Jews. Well, here's a question. Okay, you have those two stories. You have one about jihad and revolution, and you have one about decolonization and revolution. Which one is true? Which one does Hamas really, the Hamas warriors, the Hamas leadership, when they sit down and they plan these things, what do they think that they are doing? I would say they actually think that they're doing both. I think the world today is much more fluid than a lot of us give it credit. That is, what you do have today, that you have ideological movements that can influence each other and become a hybrid ideology of the symbols and the understandings that once were truly separate, once were truly different, but today are inseparable from each other. I do not believe that in the thought of Hamas leaders today's, the revolutionary leftist ideologies that they have been also influenced with are are separable at all from Islamic fundamentalism or radicalism of hating the Jews and killing the Jews. Hating the Jews and killing the Jews are synonym with hating the occupier and the colonizer and killing the occupier and the colonizer. Now, the problem with this narrative, and I think that what makes a lot of people uncomfortable with it, especially young Jews, is that this idea of decolonization has been so pervasive that almost everyone now is indoctrinated with it. I mean, I've been to Jewish Zionist events where I spoke to these things, and many times the young students themselves, they were sold to that ideology. They believed that decolonization is good, something that's eternally good. But the difference is that they try legitimate Zionism by saying that no, Zionism is decolonization. And I'm sure that you heard that before. So the idea, of course, that Zionism itself is decolonization. I think that this is in my opinion, is a lost battle. The idea of decolonization itself is an ideological idea. That is, it's not really, it's not like the word cup. So cup is a noun that really describes something. It could be a cup of tea, could be a cup of water, it could be a cup of whatever. I think the cup of decolonization is already full. It's not really, you can't empty it and put something in it again. It's already full. It's already full with anti-Western ideology, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism, and anti-white ideology. I'm not white, but it's very clear to me that it's also there, and anti-capitalist ideology. I mean, decolonization, for example, never happened against the Russians. I mean, Masha here is from a Russian background. Everybody knows the colonial and imperialist history of Russia, whether before the Soviet Union or after the Soviet Union. To the extent that I don't know a lot about the history of that area, but I've met enough people from countries bordering Russia who seem to hate Russia. That tells me that they must have had a really bad history together. Decolonization, decolonial ideology never speak about the Russians, or never speaks about the Soviet Union. It never speaks about the history of Islamic imperialism itself. As a matter of fact, the nations, Muslim and dynasties nations, had very long imperialist history. One could say that they were the first true masters of the slave trade in Africa and other places. You never hear about this decolonization. As a matter of fact, there are good questions about, well, how did people in whatever that place that you call Palestine end up speaking Arabic? How did people in Egypt end up speaking Arabic? What about Sudan? How did they end up speaking Arabic? They speak Arabic in Somalia, in Chad. These are all, Chad is like heart of dark Africa. How did they end up speaking Arabic? You don't find people reasonably, the same people who take the concepts of anti-imperialism and decolonization seriously, you don't find them talking about this because, as I said, the cup of decolonization is already full. They already have the contents of that cup. Trying to use it, I think, is a lost cause. And here I'm not trying to recruit people against left-wing ideology or for right-wing ideology. I'm trying to describe what I think I am clearly seeing. Not to mention that if you actually go to the roots, the intellectual roots of these concepts, and that's kind of what I've been doing actually for the past few years. Decolonization, when did it start? When did people start talking this way? You'll find that brute and extreme violence was always part of the mix from the very beginning. So, for example, you had professors saying after October 7th, well, what did you think decolonization mean? Did you think it was nice? I don't know if you saw this. People who've been engaged, I'm sure, saw things like that. Of course, decolonization is violent. That's because at the very birth of the idea and that intellectual revolutionary theology of decolonization, it was meant to be violent. It was meant to be brutal. It was meant to be ruthless. And it is anti-humanistic in every possible way. Now, I do not see why a concept like that wouldn't merge very easily with Hamas's concept of jihadism, right? If you have a concept of jihadism that's also very violent, we've all seen what terrorist jihadist groups have been doing in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, ISIS, Al Qaeda. All of these are different forms of jihadism. I don't understand why would Hamas person think that there is some sort of a separation that they need to uphold between the concept of this, the concept of that. Concepts are in the air. They are not real. The truth is the content, whatever is in that cup, it's the same. It's brute and extreme violence. And here you have a merge between what Hamas is doing and between the fantasies that a lot, sadly, of the most educated people in Western universities and Western cities in general have in their mind, that fantasy of decolonization and anti-imperialism, so that Palestine, and also Palestine itself, now became this very big fantasy, kind of like Avatar, you know, that those blue people who lived very harmoniously in an ecological friendly civilization. They were so in tune with nature. They actually hooked themselves up to the animals that they ride. And it was just a white mechanized man that came and tried to destroy all of that. That's kind of became Palestine, a whole theology and just a a fictitious history was brought up about Palestine that was eco-sustainable before capitalism, before the Jews, before Zionism, and you had the great Palestinians, harvesting their olive groves and orange groves and so on, and then the Jew, who here stands for a lot of things. He stands for modernity, stands for capitalism, stands for nationalism, stands of all of the things that people in the universities hate, right? They came and they brought all of these ugly things with them. And in order to restore this lost paradise, what you have to have is this decolonization, which is those subalterns come back and decolonize their land from this foreign capitalist invader. This is really not very different than what a naive, gullible Muslim in a mosque in the Gaza Strip being told about, living in the great lands of Islam that was perfect, harmonious. The word of Allah was everywhere. And then those infidel Jews, those pigs came and they destroyed all of that. And then we have to kick them out to restore our land. Here, what I want to suggest is for you to actually discard ideology, discard the story. The stories obviously are just used to legitimate the killing and the murder and the hatred of Jews. This is what ultimately this is about. These are stories. You can tell them at Harvard about social justice and decolonization. You can tell the same story in a mosque in Gaza about Allah and those filthy Jews, and Islam and Muslims have to return to their land. Obviously here, these stories are going to be told in a no matter what way that ultimately justifies and legitimates Jew hatred and terrorism against the Jews. And this is ultimately, I believe, what we need to focus on. What we need to center is the extreme violence, the anti-humanism, and the anti-Semitism of these people, whether in the Gaza Strip or whether here. That doesn't mean that these stories and ideologies don't matter. The only reason I believe that they matter is that there are a lot of people who believe in them. That's why I spend so much time and my efforts to actually try to find out who says what, why, when did this start, when did people start talking this way. Not because that I think that these ideas have any independent existence on their own, but because there are a lot of people who seem to believe in this. There are a lot of people who actually follow this. A lot of young people, a lot of students, and this is why it's important to call these things out. for what they are. These are all mystifications, delusions that are created for people to mystify and hide the actual reality. And the actual reality, we can see it on our cell phones. You can see it on your laptop in high definition, in 4K, in GoPro videos. I don't know how Hamas got so many GoPros. I was actually shocked when I watched the videos. I actually had that question in mind. I thought there was a blockade and they can't even get food or medicine. And the Israelis, and then they have all of these GoPros. I don't own a GoPro. You have all of these fancy GoPros. You can watch the videos in 4K and see the inhumanity of this hatred for Israel and hatred for the Jewish people. This is why I believe it's very important to engage with those things, and it's very important to insist on the truth. Actually, I love the story that Masha told us at the beginning about the student. She sent me. She actually, before the webinar, she sent me the message saying that a student just sent me to this today, and I was like, you good kid, good for him or her. And that's what you should do. You should insist on the truth. You should not let people get away with mystification, with garbage that they can discuss with fancy ideological terms, whether about Islamism, religious fundamentalism, or decolonization and social justice and anti-imperialism. By the end of the day, no, we're talking about real violence, real murder, real people who are losing their lives. I hope this was helpful in any ways. I would love to have any questions you have. But before I do, I want to encourage you to register for the Club Z Eye on Zion series. I have no doubt, as I said, it's going to be great. Club Z, I've always seen them provide only the best of education. And if you're not going to register, you must consider supporting Club Z. Club Z is a great organization that really takes the education of real Zionist education for young pupils, young Jews, seriously. And I have no doubt that their crash course would be useful for everyone, whether they were a young student or not. So I would love to now to hear any questions you have.
Awesome, great. Let me introduce Dan Brooks, who is going to be moderating the questions. Dan, are you able to come on?
I'm just able to speak. So for now, I can do that until you can make me magically appear. But I can start asking questions.
Yeah, just start.
Okay. One question right off the bat is this dichotomy or supposed dichotomy in Palestinian society with extremists and moderates. We've heard surveys and polls recently that are very dark that basically depict that majority of Palestinians support Hamas and that extremism. What is the future of Palestinian society, and how can we move them towards reform? Is that for them solely to do? And what is the role of the international community in Israel in moving Palestinians to a more moderate position?
Wow. It's a very difficult question. This is actually the question I've been talking about with a lot of people, Israeli and Arab diplomats, for the past week. And that's kind of the billion-dollar question that nobody knows how to solve, because it's obviously a very difficult question. Radicalism is not a fringe in Palestinian society. That's the problem. The very content of Palestinian identity is radicalism. That's the tragedy. That's the true tragedy of the Palestinians. That is, what are identities? First of all, most of I'm one of the most arrogant people I've ever met. I think most people are especially professors are full of it. They don't know what they're talking about. Identities that has been, or the talk of identity that really filled everything. I think again, it's very toxic and very stupid. What an identity is basically a story. That's really what an identity is. A story about who you think you are. So the story, either you tell yourself, or you receive from your community, or it's a mixture of two. So if you tell yourself that you are a good person who tries to live a good life, loves it, that really becomes part of your identity, because that's a story you told yourself. Jewish identity is a story. It's a great story. It's a wonderful story. It's one of actually the best stories ever and oldest stories ever told. And that's why It's so ancient and so rich. The Palestinian identity is a story, right? Egyptian identity is a story. I grew up in Egypt telling, well, we're Egyptian. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means that we've been here for 7,000 years, and our ancestors built those great buildings, and look at those pyramids, and look at that fancy stuff, and then we became Christian, and then we became Muslim. It's a story. The Palestinian identity is a story. What is the story of the Palestinian identity? Well, we were sitting in our tents, very happy and content. I was peeling the oranges, I was pressing my olives, and then all of a sudden, this ugly European Jew came with this big, ugly machine. That's literally the Palestinian story, right? Is there anything else that is what it means to be a Palestinian? And destroyed my tent and killed my child and took my land and took my olive oil and sold my own orange. That's the story of the Palestinian. You're not going to have. How are you going to de-radicalize that, right? If this is a story that you tell yourself about who you are. So the idea that radicalism somehow is a fringe in Palestinian society, first of all, it's not true. You can look at the data. You can look at the support for Hamas. You can look at the videos in the civilians celebrating the Hamas murder as they coming back on October 7th. And I'm here, I'm not dehumanizing them. And by the way, I used to believe in these things myself. And I don't think that I'm a subhuman no, I do believe in the humanity of people. Sorry, yes. So it's not a fringe. It's very common, and it's very common. What the reason I brought up Palestinian identity, I said it's very common for a good reason. The very story is bad. It's a really, really bad story, and it really makes sense if you're a young Palestinian. And first of all, you're growing up in a less than ideal situation, whether Gaza or the West Bank, you have limitations. You have this, not to mention the political corruption and all the problems of Palestinian society. And then this is a story that's being told about you. That is, well, why am I living like this? Why can't I travel to outside? Why can't I do this? Well, it's because we're Palestinian, son. Well, what does it mean being Palestinian? And then I tell you that story. Me taking a rifle or a bomb or wanting to join a resistance, so-called it makes sense. It's really not that crazy if this is who I am. De-radicalizing Palestinian society ultimately means that being Palestinian, which is now a reality, sadly. I wish there weren't Palestinians. I mean, that would be easy. There are a lot of people who say, well, the Palestinians don't exist. No, they didn't exist until very recently. That's true. But sadly, now they exist. What they needed is a different meaning for what a Palestinian, a different story. That is the content of what being a Palestinian means, or the content of the identity of Palestine has to change. This is an ambitious process and will take a very long time. One of the main difficulties and opportunities here is that most people don't build their own identity. And most people don't build their own opinions. Where does the average person gets their opinion from? Their surroundings, from what they say in school, what they say in the mosque, what they say on the coffee shop, what I hear on the radio, what I hear on TV. That's really most average people, no matter if they were in Gaza, the West Bank, or New York. That's where they get their opinions from. So what you need to do is you need to actually control and transform these institutions that are responsible for making the opinions. That's what you need to do. There are things you can do. UNRWA, for example. Here we have a big institution that's been sadly perpetuating all of this because it's been educating generations of Palestinian children into that terrible story. You have the mosques, you have the textbooks. You can work with countries like the UAE in order to try to rewrite Palestinian textbooks, and like they did in their country. So the UAE till recently also had a lot of anti-Semitism in their textbooks. It was awful like everywhere else. Today, they are really the golden standard in the Middle East in terms of tolerance and acceptance of the other in education. You can get them to work with you to do things like that. But this will take a lot of political muscles from all the parties involved, and sadly, it's very hard to move things right now, given first of all the complications in Israeli politics at the moment, and of course you have an administration in the United States that doesn't see the world. I wish they see the world the way we see it, but they see it from the Disneyland prism, in which there are no big problems. It's just small problems that we need to engineer, and that's it. If I may add something very quickly, there's also another complication I actually completely missed. So it's my fault. I should have mentioned this while I was talking, which is that you do have actors who do have real interest in maintaining the conflict. So if you're talking about Qatar, if you talk about Iran, you're talking about major players. So Qatar, for example, is one of the richest countries on earth. This is not an exaggeration. They have more money than anybody. They spend more money in the United States on influence than any other country in the world. They spend, Qatar, by the way, the population of Qatar is about 200,000 people. That's like a neighborhood in New York. The country of 200,000 citizens spend on buying American universities more than China does. That's how much money they have, and that's how much money they spend. Qatar has a serious interest in keeping the Palestinian-Israeli conflict the way it is. And then, of course, you have the major, really, a 8,000-pound elephant in the room is Iran. October 7th was not just Hamas, was not just the Palestinians. This also something is missed from all of these narratives, whether jihad, whether decolonization. Hamas is an Iranian proxy. They actually did this in order to serve Iranian plans for the entire region. So no plan to change that reality, no plan to end the Palestinian conflict, no plan to de-radicalize the Palestinians will succeed as long as you have this very big and wealthy actors who have an interest in the Palestinians being terrorists. We saw this in the past with the Soviet Union. So they are not the first ones, by the way, to do this. Sadly, the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a history of major wars in which basically this conflict was a theater. So we saw this with the Soviet Union, who did this with the Palestinians. We saw this with Egypt and Syria, who were also larger actors who were fighting over bigger things, and they used the Palestinians. They are probably responsible for this entire mess to begin with. So right now, it's the turn of Iran. They are carrying the banner and playing. They are the ones who picked up the ball, and they are playing it. So you'll also have to do something about that.
Okay, I have to follow up. Why does Qatar wants to keep the conflict going?
Because first of all, it gives them a lot of influence. Palestine is not a real place, right? We agreed, right? It's not a real place. It's like Wakanda. It's the Avatar planet. You're laughing, but for Palestinians, but here's the thing: for Arabs, we're talking about 300 million people. And then a large segment of the Muslim population of the world, it is like that. So it's this fantasy of a lost paradise that symbolizes a lot of things, right? It symbolizes the loss of Islamic glory. It symbolizes the loss of Muslim innocence. It symbolizes loss, both nationally, religiously, mystically, and psychologically. Right, it's kind of like the fall, the Christian concept of the fall, right? The brokenness of man. That's basically Palestine. It became an allegory for everything that's really bad about our world, right? No human rights, bad economic development, and that's why rich Muslim countries don't care. By the way, it's like you'll find it the cause of the poor, dysfunctional, failed people. It represents failure, represents a loss of our identity of who we are. And Israel became basically the symbol of everything that's bad: the lack of human rights, imperialism, failure, tyranny, despotism, economic failure, so on and so forth. So here you're talking about a cause that holds this very strong pull, a symbolic and religious and psychological on a lot of Arabs and Muslims, not just religious people, atheists. I've met Muslims who became atheists, who now eat pork and drink alcohol, but they hate Israel and they defend Palestine. That's how deep the issue became. It requires somebody like Sigmund Freud really to analyze the entire thing. But this is how much influence the Palestinian cause is. Actually, the Arab Spring, so very quickly, the Middle East went through a big wave of instability that was called the Arab Spring back in 2011, 2012, from it ISIS came out. That's kind of, it was a big shattering moment in which a lot of states collapsed. Libya collapsed, Syria collapsed, Sudan collapsed, Egypt barely stayed stable. It's just that the entire thing, it threatened the entire region with destruction. And since then, all of the Arab efforts from the wealthiest and most powerful Arabs was about moving away from that, right? Stabilizing everything, getting away from revolutions and demonstrations and ISIS. We want to build fancy buildings. We want to all go to Dubai and do shopping, and let's just get away from that. The first mass protests in the Arab street since the Arab Spring, when do you think they happened? The first time people again went out very angry in like tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. October 7th, right? That's how effective Palestine. So why Qatar wants? Because Qatar now positioned itself as one of the custodians of the Palestinian cause, right? They are the supporters of Hamas. They are the ones who help Hamas. Al Jazeera, their network, which is a huge problem, is the primary propaganda outlet for pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas propaganda all over the Middle East. And by virtue of their association, think about it is a major virtue signaling, right? Let's say in Western society, you know, you have a lot of forms of virtue signaling, right? In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, love is love. You know, these signs that you had in front of houses, ecological virtue signaling. Palestine is something like that, but on steroids, right? I am a guardian of Palestine. And that gives them a lot of influence all over the region. And this is the same exact reason that Iran is using this. The same exact reason is because it gives it a lot of influence, gives it a lot of power. And that power gives you legitimacy. It gives you legitimacy for your action, right? So wait a minute. Okay, why are you occupying Iraq, right? Iran, for example. Why do you have people in Iraq? Well, it's all part of my master plan to liberate Palestine. That's it. You don't need to say anything else. You just legitimized and justified everything you're doing. Well, why are you bombing Saudi Arabia? The Houthis, which is an Iranian proxy, have been bombing oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. Well, because they have been talking to the Zionist enemy, and they've been trying to normal. It justifies it just by the virtue of the moral principle that became Palestine. It justifies everything. The Iranians, by the way, don't actually care about the Palestinians. They don't care about Palestine. They don't care about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is primarily a Sunni. The funny thing is that Jerusalem is historically a Sunni city. There is Shia Islam, there's Sunni Islam. Jerusalem is really a Sunni city. It never really figured in Sunni theology and Shia theology. But all of a sudden, after the Islamic Revolution, Jerusalem became very important for the Shia Muslims and became very important for Iran. But it's majorly a part of that bid for regional hegemony. I hope that I explained the question without actually obscuring it.
I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
Dan, you want to summarize a question?
Yeah. Well, a couple loaded questions, and you just alluded to Iran. What do you foresee as Iran's, and by extension, its proxies in Lebanon and Yemen? What are their next moves? How far are they willing to carry out their program immediately, and then maybe in the more medium term?
Things are bad. I mean, we're looking at a very explosive 2024. I think so. Iran, nobody wants an all-out war. And even the Iranians don't want that because they know in an all-out war, the United States and Israel will win. They will, yes, they will take damage. They will take a lot of damage, but ultimately they will win. There is not a major war that the United States or Israel did not enter that they didn't come out victorious. The strategy of Iran is what Iran has been doing for years. That is instability, proxies, terrorist groups here and there, basically altering the reality slowly. You know, it's a death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's just like a salami slicing. I'm going to slice it a little piece by little piece. And that's actually what Commander Qasem Soleimani, I don't know if people are familiar with the name. Qasem Soleimani was that big IRGC Iranian military leader who was thankfully assassinated by President Trump a few years ago. One of the best foreign policy decisions in the recent history of the United States. Qasem Soleimani, it was such a big deal because he was a military genius who actually devised this strategy. He basically thought, listen, those Arab idiots, They went to war with Israel all of these times, and every time they just got their, butts handed to them. They were defeated badly. You can't go to war with Israel in this way. What we can do is we can suffocate Israel slowly. We can suffocate them in a sea of chaos and instability, in violence, in rockets. And that's exactly what, if you think about it, that's what's been happening for the past 10 years or so, right? You have Hezbollah building up. You have Hamas building up. You have the Palestinian Islamic Jihad building up. You have militias in Syria. You have drones coming trying to attack Israel from the Golan Heights. That's Israel. And it's a strategy against the presence of the United States in the region generally. So I do not foresee that Iran right now would want to change that strategy because it's winning. They've been winning for the last 10 years. The United States doesn't look good. Everybody now even the U.S. Arab allies are afraid of the future because they don't really trust that the United States will do the right thing with Iran. So I don't see that Iran would want. Why would you change a strategy that's winning? That the challenge that they have at the moment is controlling the consequences of what happened on October 7th without Israel destroying and the United States destroying too much of their infrastructure that they've already built, but without at the same time looking weak in the region. They want to still look the strong. They want to be the one looking we're the ones who have the initiative against Israel and the United States. So it's going to be a dance. Also, don't forget that now we are in an election year in the United States, and trust me, nobody in DC would want to do anything serious in the Middle East in an election year. And I think the Iranians know this. So everybody right now is risk averse and war avoidant. And I think the Americans more than anybody, and the Iranians know this. So if things continue at the pace they are, it depends also on what the Israeli war cabinet is going to decide. Are they going to decide to keep dancing this dance with Hezbollah in Lebanon, or actually take them out, or do something, or escalate? It will really depend on all of these factors. So it's really hard to see. I would say if the Israelis and the Americans want to keep doing what they're doing right now, the Iranians will take it. They will keep doing that, and just keep playing the game that they've been playing for long term. And that's why I think we need to stop playing it, because that's exactly what they've been winning. I don't want to start a big war in the Middle East. It's going to be bad for everybody. But I think the United States needs to be much more decisive. We can do things like we assassinated, Qasem Soleimani was a big deal. Even the moment, I don't know if the people listening were remembering it. The American media really was shameful. What they have done was shameful then. They attacked Trump daily. They almost ran apologetics for the Iranian regime because of the Trump derangement effect. I'm not a lover of Trump, but there is just reality. The president of the United States just killed the #1 terrorist in the world. And you had people on CNN and MSNBC crying, he's crazy, he's going to start World War III. The Iranians are a paper tiger. They did nothing. Soleimani died, and they just licked their wounds and moved on. This is what the United States can do, but what the United States refused to do. One last thing, and that's actually, now we talked about the 80,000 pounds elephant in the room. Well, there's a 1 million pounds elephant in the room, which is the Iranian nuclear program. Iran has a very sophisticated and very advanced nuclear program. This is actually the biggest problem that's nobody's talking about at the moment. And the centrifuges is running as we speak. We don't have oversight. We don't have eyes over their nuclear program. We don't know how far they are ahead. But if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, that will be, of course, a game changer. That will be a whole different game entirely. And hopefully, Israel will not let this happen. I don't trust Washington, but I hope that Israel won't.
Okay. We need more hours with Hussein, which some of us will have during crash course. So we're going to run crash courses for teens and for adults. And Hussein is coming to teach teens at the end of January. So if you have teens, sign them up and they will get a whole private session with Hussein. But I want to go back to the basics because there are a lot of questions came in, and I'm just going to kind of do a congregate of them. And that is, truth be told, if I said what you have said about Palestine and Palestinians, I
Yeah.
would immediately be branded as a radical Islamophobe.
Yes.
So that's why you're saying it and not me.
Yeah, it's really sad.
So that's, I guess it's a comment and a question, like, how do you explain that, this is just the fact, no matter who is delivering that? And a few questions came in basically asking, where are the moderate Muslims, right? And how do we deal with the innocent Palestinians that are being killed in Gaza? And, you know, how do you I know how I would answer it, and that's how, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is answering it, and Israel's spokesperson is answering it. But do you have any other answers for the second question? What would you say for the first?
Okay, I'll start with the second question. It's of course it's heartbreaking for innocent people to die. But the truth is, and this is not a, I'm not being a politician, but the truth is, Hamas is the number one, is the address of these complaints. Hamas could have ended the war. We're in January 3rd now. They could have ended the war a week after it started, had they decided to release all of the hostages and give up power in Gaza. I would tell you, yeah, I've been working with Congress for the past 3 years. Israelis would have hated it, because Israelis, that would have been too early. You just had the massacres happen on October 7th. Israelis wanted to kill they still want to kill every Hamas member, which is a very legitimate. I want that too. So they wouldn't have wanted to agree to stop the war just because all the hostages are freed, and Hamas is just, I'm out of power. The Palestinian Authority can have it. But the White House, Biden would have traveled to Israel and would have made the Israelis do it, right? And it would have happened. Who didn't do it? Hamas. Hamas did not do this. Hamas preferred to hold, listen to this. Hamas preferred to hold on to Jewish babies and women and old men, anti workers, and the other Israeli men that they have. It's not like, young men are not have any less value. They chose to hold them as hostages, and to hold on to power in Gaza over saving the lives of thousands of Gazan civilians. This is the priorities of Hamas. As a matter of fact, Hamas factored in all of this before October 7th. That is, they've already playing this game for too long with Israel, right? You go, you do something, you fire rockets, you kill some Israelis, Israel will come bomb you, you will hide behind civilians, a few thousands will die. This is a formula without fail. That's been, how many rounds have we had so far, Masha? Do you remember of this? Many. We've been having these rounds at least once every 2 years. So basically, the Hamas factored in this before they did October 7th, that Israel will come in and will kill and will be very angry, and they will kill thousands of people, and fine. This is the priority of Hamas. Hamas does not value the lives of the Palestinians. They do not actually value any life. So the number one complaint, or the address for this complaint, is actually Hamas. Hamas could have ended this. Hamas could end this still now, if they still do this. I know for a fact that there are Arab ministers who suggested this to Hamas, and the Hamas said no. They told Hamas, you can just end all of it. Just give up power to Mahmoud Abbas, who's not I'm not a fan of Mahmoud Abbas either, but just give him the power. Say, okay, we're done. We're out of government. Take the hostages and take Mahmoud Abbas, and we're gonna ship us to Tunisia. This happened, by the way, in Lebanon with the PLO. But they chose not to. So you have to remember that very clearly. The responsibility of the state of Israel is to protect their own citizens, and that's what Israel has been trying to do, and that's why the White House and the United States has been supporting Israel in what it's doing. Now, the problem with I don't know, I can't help you, to be honest, with the question of how to say these things to people. The people are there are a lot of people who are very indoctrinated. Indoctrination now just became actually the mainstream. Most people, I would say, especially the ones who went to college, are indoctrinated in with these very toxic ideologies. I'm not saying you don't have to try, but first of all, people who hate the Jews will always hate the Jews no matter what, right? You see these posts. Sometimes I see this stuff on social media when they have a screenshot of somebody who was posting about how Gaza was an open air prison, like right before October 7th. It's just the Israelis are destroying it. And after the war and after all the destruction, they are crying about how Gaza used to be a paradise before the war, right? So you see all of those inconsistent people, they will stay inconsistent, right? These people are not after facts or after truth. They live in a club in which they hate Jews and they hate Israelis, and they are with resistance no matter what. So no matter what, the argument is needed. And this is why I said, don't pay too much attention. The ideology, yes, the story matters, what is being said, but many times it's just used to legitimate the crimes that are being committed. It's just that they will say whatever is needed. So you have a lot of those people. You're not going to get anywhere with those people, right? Don't waste your time. Don't waste your time with people who are just lack any critical thinking. What you need to do, first of all, your friends, people who are close to you, and people you have personal relationships with, and building those personal relationships and reaching out. And as a community, I think the Jewish community needs to build strong relationships with other communities that also have been hurting from this, because this is getting to a critical point. You have entire communities who have been radicalized in the past 10 years or even more, to like subscribe to these decolonization, eco-socialism, anti-Zionist, anti-nationalist ideology whatsoever. And I think it has reached a critical moment. We saw what happened with the big schools, with Harvard, with Yale, with Princeton, so on and so forth. And it's time to actually try to build connections with other people who've been hurting from this ideology as well.
Thank you, Hussein. So this next one is a two-parter. It's another meaty one about looking into the future. So first question, what is the future of Gaza? Can it actually serve as a pivot point for some kind of stability, long-term, medium-term? Part B, what is the future of the Abraham Accords post-October 7th?
That's a good question. Actually, I forgot to answer a part of Masha's question, so I'm gonna combine it with the Abraham Accords question, which is where are the moderate Muslims? There are actually, I have to say, so things look really, really bad because what happened is one of the worst tragedies in modern Jewish history and in the history of Israel. But actually, there are positive things. There's today in this round of conflict, there are more Muslim voices that are pro-Israel, that are anti-terrorism than ever. You can actually count the improvement. I'm not saying like there are a million Muslims in the street marching for Israel, but listen, I wrote a book a few years ago about my story. It was called A Minority of One, and that's actually how I felt. Today, I wouldn't say minority of one. I would say maybe ahead of the curve. But no, there are increasing number of people from various countries. I know I follow people online. I see people from the UAE. I see Saudis coming very strongly against Hamas, saying Israel has the right to do whatever, and they're still living in their countries. They're not. They didn't go through what I went through. They didn't get arrested. They didn't get any. So this is actually a real tangible change. So I think there is a battle that started now, I think, among Muslim and Arab communities, more in the Middle East than here, about this issue, and there is an actual, for the first time, there's an actual force that are anti-Hamas. And that's a big deal, because usually, even if you had a force that was anti-Al-Qaeda, for example, you had a social force, but you would never have a force that is anti-anything Palestinian, because the story that I told, right? Palestine is the ultimate fulfillment of everything that's good. The moral vision of Islam is Palestine. the fulfillment of communism, if you're a communist, is Palestine. So even they would go condemn Al-Qaeda, they would go condemn ISIS, but not the Palestinians, not suicide bombings against the Israelis. This is the first time that this is actually happening. You do have it's a voice. It exists, and you can hear it loud on social media. As I said, it's not very big, but still, the virtue of its existence is good. This has to do with the Abraham Accords, because I can tell you with actual knowledge that the reason that this exists because there are people in power in Arab countries who want it to exist. That is, there are Arab rulers today who are done with Palestine. They are not going to say that publicly. They will still go and say we love Palestine. Those Zionist criminals are bombing it because they have to, because you're in power. And if you're in power, your number one priority is the same power. It's not really, to say the truth, to be honest with you. So they're gonna go out, but then you can actually look at what they're doing. You'll find that some of them are not giving $1 in aid to Gaza. I'm not kidding. Some of those loudest ones, they are so mad at the Palestinians, they haven't given $1 since then. Some of them constricted all of what they are sending to just medical equipment and not helping with anything else because of how angry they are. Because, as I said, part of this is an Iranian plan to begin with against them, and they know that is that Hamas is part of a club that wants to destroy them and take their own power. So the bottom line is that voice exists today in some Arab countries because there are people in power who want it to exist. So the Abraham Accords are continuing. That the Abraham Accords are not actually going to be affected by this. What happened is that now you have challenges to the Abraham Accords that you have to talk about seriously. That I'm glad they'll be there, because if I have to air, how much time do we have? Not much. Okay, very, very briefly, if I have to air some of my own bitterness and grievances, I've been working with a lot of people who are working on the Abraham Accords for the past 3 years. Very wonderful people. They are not woke or leftist or anything, but they are too liberal. That is classical liberal. There is such a thing as too classical liberal. What is too classical liberal? It's all about business. Let's just, if we make them buy stuff from each other, that's it. That's all we do. And I've been trying to tell them that's great, but we need to do educational stuff. We need to do culture stuff. And they're like, no, business, companies, infrastructure. And they look at me as if I'm an idiot. They are the ones today who realize that that's not true. In one moment, one operation of Hamas can just make 200 million Arabs angry in the streets. So you have to actually do educational thing. You do have to do cultural thing. So now this challenge, finally, those two liberal people, now they see it, and hopefully they will things will come out of it. And this is why you're talking about de-radicalization in Gaza. By the way, nobody ever talked about this before. I met people who told me things that are insulting. You know what they need in Gaza? Costco. If they get Costco, their life will be much better. Their problem will be solved. Like, why don't we give every young Palestinian a Corvette? I mean, this is too absurd, but I actually heard things like this. But now, finally, I had people from the Israeli embassy here in DC, people from the Israeli embassy in Dubai, talking to me about, how can we help change their education? How can we change this is unprecedented. I never heard anybody wanting to talk about this before. So hopefully these conversations will continue and will yield something and will yield change. I'm actually optimistic. And I know that this sounds crazy. With all the insanity that we just talked about, I am more optimistic about the Middle East today than I was 5 years ago. I am less optimistic about the United States than I was 5 years ago. That is, the Middle East hit the rock bottom. I mean, we already had ISIS. We watched beheadings at 4K. You're not going to get lower than that. So there's only going up from here, right? The fact, if you get 20 social media activists who are anti-terrorism and pro-Israel, that's a huge, that's a historic event. So you're actually getting better. So I can see things getting better there, and I can see things getting much, much worse here.
All right.
And what do you think will happen in Gaza? Just gonna follow up.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I don't know. It depends on, first of all, Israelis have to destroy Hamas. You're not going to get any real change as long as you have Hamas there. This is not it's not an if. It can't be a question. The Israelis must deliver. They promised that they will. There are actually many people who are depending on the Israelis. even if they're not saying that publicly, they are depending on the Israelis to get that done. There is nothing will happen if Hamas stays where they are. Hamas must be destroyed, and then I think you can have plans for reconstruction. So, but this depends on a lot of details. For example, the current Israeli government, and I'm not trying to be political, but the current Israeli government, it has a very bad habit of saying terrible things and alienating people and creating problems that should not be created, and lost a lot of trust with a lot of allies that they had. And I think that's a big problem. For example, there were, from Israeli ministers today, there were talks or some statements that were made about sending Palestinians, the Gazans, to Congo. Needless to say, in 2024, saying something like that, you're not gonna win any friends, and you're gonna alienate people, and you're really giving ammunition to the people who hate you. So it will also have to do with the ability of this government or the next government to build some trust, both domestically and with other people, and will depend on the United States and will depend on Iran. So there are a lot of factors, really. Again, ideally, the ideal is you finish Hamas, Palestinians go back, you have some sort of a governing body in which you'll have Israel, the United States, maybe some representative from the EU, some representative from Arab governments. The Americans will give money, the Saudis will give money, the Emiratis will give money. There are talks about Arab governments taking charge of education. They are still a very preliminary. No one knows if this is going to actually happen, but it's a possibility. It's a possibility to get one of those good Arab governments that we know that they don't want this anymore to actually take charge of Palestinian education. But of course, politics again, right? They will ask you something. They're not because they know they are doing you a favor. They will so all of this have to be figured out. But that's the ideal. And then maybe you can have a different Gaza, but that will take time. You still need a generation or two until you actually produce a new generation that didn't grow under the rule of Hamas. But what I want to say, it's possible, but the Israelis have to help, and the Israelis have to want it, and the Israelis have to believe that this is possible. One of the big criticisms that I do have a lot of criticisms, by the way, on Zionists and Israelis and Jews, and one of the big criticisms that I think that they never actually believed is that it is possible, right? The Palestinians are this awful and will always be this awful. I agree with half of the statement. I agree that the Palestinians are this awful, but I actually, more than anybody, I can write books about that what being a Palestinian means and how awful it is. But I don't agree with the assertion that it will always be this way. I think no. I too once believed in a lot of this, and they're not this way anymore. I think if we actually invest in the education of those people, in a dream, call it a fantasy, that one day being a Palestinian will mean something different. I don't know. Will mean somebody who loves olive. Something different than what it means right now. I think then you get somewhere. And as I said, for the first time, I'm hearing people talking about it. Some Israeli diplomats talking about it, some Israeli politicians talking about it. So hopefully we'll see something out of it.
That is the most positive ending we could possibly have, honestly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hussein. Truly, it has been a pleasure and an honor. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I would be remiss if I didn't plug in a couple of Club Z offerings that are coming up. In less than 2 weeks, we are hosting our national conference. It's going to be in Los Angeles this time. So if you're in LA, come check it out. We are running a crash course for teens, for teenagers, and for adults. And again, Hussein will be teaching our first cohort. So don't wait. So the first cohort is only for teens. Don't wait with your teenagers. Sign them up quickly. And then, Dan, can you tell us about the next speaker?
Sure. Hard to top Hussein, but we have a very dynamic speaker for our next webinar, Nico Black, who is an ex-IDF humanitarian liaison. Very nuanced views of Israel. He is an Israel advocate. and activist. His mother was a founding member of B'Tselem. For those who know, B'Tselem is quite critical of Israel. His father, late father, was the Guardian's Middle East editor. So he comes at Israel now from a very interesting perspective. The topic is the humanist perspective and how being a humanist puts you on Israel's side. So that is going to be on Wednesday, January 17th, same time. We'll send out more details about that one, and looking forward to having everyone join us then.
I want to say thank you also for everyone. Thank you for having me, Masha. Always a pleasure to Clubsy. Thank you for all who tuned in to my webinar tonight. Again, please register to that crash course and support Clubsy. Support the great work of Clubsy and the great mission that they have been fulfilling. This kind of education, I promise you, are not going to get in Harvard.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Hussein. Thank you so much for your time and your tireless work. You really are an amazing person. Thank you for everything you do. And thank you everyone for joining us.
All right. Good night, everybody.